She was kneeling on my front porch with salt fog rolling in behind her, one hand pressed against the wooden boards and the other wrapped around her stomach like she was holding together the only thing that still mattered. Her right eye was nearly swollen shut. Her voice broke on 2 words. Papa Art. And then she said his name, my firstborn. And the night split cleanly into everything before and everything that would come after. But to understand what that name meant when she said it, to understand why it landed the way it did, and why it changed the course of this family, in ways I am still measuring, I need to take you back to the beginning of that night. Before the porch, before the fog, before any of it, I am so grateful you are here with me today. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from, your country, your city. I want to know. Every name in that comment section reminds me why these stories are worth telling. A small note. This story contains fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the message inside it is worth keeping. Some nights in Gull Harbor the fog comes in so thick you cannot see the lighthouse at the end of the point, even though it has been standing there longer than anyone alive can remember. That was one of those nights. The kind where the whole coast goes silent, and the ocean sounds closer than it should, like it has moved up the bluff while you were not paying attention, and is now breathing just outside your window. The kind of night you remember, not for what it sounded like, but for what it changed. I was sitting in my kitchen at 11 holding a cup of coffee. I had no business drinking at that hour, when everything in my life began moving in a direction I had not prepared for. My name is Arthur James Callahan. Most people in Gull Harbor call me Papa Art. I am 70 years old, a retired shipwright, and I have lived in the same house on Whalers Bluff for 33 years. I built most of it myself with Helen beside me handing up boards and telling me when the frame was not level. She had an eye for true lines that I never quite matched, even after 40 years of building boats by hand. The house has never felt larger than it does on the nights I cannot sleep, which since Helen passed 8 years ago has been most of them. The kitchen is where I spend those hours. Helen made it that way. She kept the overhead light off and used only the small brass lamp she had brought home from the lighthouse. The year the county decommissioned it, an old fixture with a warm amber bulb that threw the whole room into a gold you could feel settle on your hands. I have kept that same bulb for 8 years, because replacing it would mean making the room look different from how she left it. I am not ready for that. Tonight the coffee is dark and too strong. Outside the bluff drops away into nothing. The lighthouse at Gull Harbor Point is invisible. No wind. No boats. Nothing except the fog pressing against the glass and the thin curl of steam rising from my mug. I reach into the drawer beside the stove and take out the journal. Leather cover the color of a chestnut hull, soft at the corners from decades of handling. The spine cracked where salt, air, and years of use have worked into the binding. 3 different hands have written in it across 3 generations. The first third belongs to my father, Captain Seamus Callahan. His handwriting is small and precise, the penmanship of a man who spent 30 years filling out harbor logs where accuracy was not optional. Dates, policy numbers, claim amounts, names of boats and the families who depended on them. All recorded in blue ink faded in places to the color of a winter sea. The second third belongs to Helen. Her handwriting is rounder, warmer, written with the care of a woman who treated every recipe like a letter to someone she loved. Clam chowder. Blueberry buckle. The brown bread she baked every Saturday until the year she could not stand long enough to wait for it to rise. On one page near the middle, she wrote Liam's favorite, and underlined it twice. The last few pages are blank. I do not know whose hand will fill them. I only know they are waiting. I open the journal tonight not to cook but to see her handwriting. The page I land on is her clam chowder, the one she made for Liam every birthday, using little neck clams from Parsons Cove. That recipe has a particular weight for me tonight. Though I could not have told you why at the time. That memory pulls me to another. A Sunday afternoon nearly 4 years ago, when Claire came through my front door carrying a white ceramic pot wrapped in a dish towel, She set it on the counter, lifted the lid, and I saw Helen's clam chowder. Not something similar. Helen's chowder. The right color, the right thickness, the cream, catching light the way it does when it has been stirred at the correct temperature for the correct amount of time. I could not speak for nearly 2 minutes. Liam had found the journal the week before, photographed every page, and given the photos to Claire without telling her what the recipe meant. She had simply chosen it because it looked like something made with love. That was the afternoon I understood who she was. My sons. You cannot understand what I am about to tell you without knowing something about them first. Brendan is 45. My firstborn. He runs a maritime insurance brokerage here in Gull Harbor, sits on the board of the Coastal Preservation Fund, and 3 years ago the Chamber of Commerce named him Citizen of the Year. He carries himself with the particular certainty of a man who believes the tide arranged itself around his arrival. I clapped at that ceremony. I was proud, and I meant it. Liam is 37. 8 years younger. A gap that holds its own quiet history. He is a boat mechanic, steady and careful by both nature and training. Tonight, he is 30 miles offshore on a disabled tugboat, working a repair that has stretched past 12 hours. He radioed at 6 to say the marine frequency was unreliable, and he might be out of contact until morning. I am thinking about Brendan, which is unusual. His life appears to require the least worrying about, but something sits low in my chest tonight, like ballast shifting in a hold. A weight, without a name. I push it aside and close the journal. That is when I hear it. A sound from the front porch. Small. Not a knock. Not a voice. Something softer and heavier than both, like a hand reaching out to steady itself against the nearest solid thing and finding only wood. It does not repeat. I set the mug down and walk to the front door. The porch light is on, the way I keep it every night. A habit Helen started, and I have never seen a reason to break. I have built boats for 40 years. I know what it looks like when something has taken on more water than it was designed to hold. When the hull is sitting too low and the waterline has disappeared, and every wave that comes over the side is one wave closer to the moment the whole thing goes under. You learn to read that in wood and fiberglass and steel. You learn it without thinking about it after enough years on the water. Claire looked like that. She was on her knees on the porch, right hand pressed flat against the boards to keep from going all the way down, left hand wrapped around her midsection in a way that was not casual and was not accidental. Her breathing came in short, measured pulls. The kind a person uses when breathing itself has become something that requires negotiation. The porch light, Helen's porch light, fell across her face, and what I saw stopped me at the threshold. Her right eye was swollen nearly shut, the skin around it already darkening to a purple that would deepen over the coming hours. Her lower lip was split at the left corner. A shadow was spreading along her jaw, the particular blue-black of a bruise that is still finding its full shape. She was wearing the gray cardigan I recognized from weekday mornings when she walked to the library, and there was a rust-colored smear along the right sleeve that I did not let myself name yet. She lifted her face toward the light. The one eye she could fully open found mine. Papa Art. She whispered it, the way you whisper something, when your voice is the last thing your body has left to give. And even that is almost spent. I crossed the porch and got my arm beneath hers. She was shaking. Not the visible kind, not trembling in any way a camera would catch. The deep, involuntary kind that lives beneath the surface, the kind that tells you a body has been holding itself rigid through sheer will for longer than any body should have to, and has finally found something solid enough to release against. 35 years of shipbuilding taught me that when something cracks, you do not demand answers before understanding what you are looking at. You study the break first, the grain, the depth, the direction of the fracture. Then you ask your questions. I brought her inside and pulled out the chair Helen always sat in, the one closest to the window where you could see the harbor lights on clear nights, and I eased Claire into it, without thinking about which chair it was. She winced as she settled, a sharp intake of breath that told me more than any medical report would later confirm. I went to the counter and reached for my phone. Her hands found my wrist before I could dial, both of them wrapping around my forearm the way a person grabs something when they are afraid it will move before they are ready. "Wait," she said. "Please. Let me tell you first." I looked at her hands on my wrist. Her left index finger was swollen along the knuckle, sitting at an angle that was not quite right. I have seen enough broken and dislocated joints in 40 years of men working with heavy timber and iron fasteners to know what I was looking at. I set the phone face down on the counter and came back to the table. "Why did you not call 911 from the house?" I asked. She did not hesitate. She had clearly thought this through on the drive over, or in the minutes she spent on the floor before she could make herself move. "If police showed up tonight," she said, "the person who did this would know immediately. He would have time to call his attorney before anyone questioned him. Time to assemble a version of the evening before a single formal question was asked." She steadied her breath. "I needed to talk to someone I trust first. Someone who could help me think before any of that starts." I sat with that. There are two kinds of people who come to your door in a crisis: those who have lost their footing and need someone to hold them upright, and those who have already assessed the damage and come to you by deliberate choice. Claire was the second kind. She had driven 25 minutes through the fog with cracked ribs and a dislocated finger, stopping twice along Harbor Road when the pain became too much to see through. She had done it with a clear reason behind every decision she had made since pulling herself off the floor. She is 33 years old. She is the head librarian at the Gull Harbor Public Library, the kind of person whose name parents know by heart, whose reading hour every Wednesday afternoon fills the children's room past capacity. When she walks into a space, the space reorganizes itself around her without anyone deciding that it should. Liam brought her to my house 9 days after their first date. I remember thinking that was either very confident or very certain. Watching Claire that evening, I understood it was the second. They have been married 4 years. For 3 of those years, they were trying to have a child. I knew this the way you know things in a family when no one tells you directly, through silences, through the way Liam would go quiet at the end of holiday dinners, sitting on the bluff in the dark. Through the mornings, Claire showed up to church with a composure that sat just slightly too carefully on her face. I never asked. 3 weeks ago, my phone rang at 7:45 in the morning. Claire's voice was shaking in a way I had never heard before. Not fear, not grief. Something too large and too new to hold steady. "Papa Art," she said. "I am pregnant. 10 weeks. I had to sit down." I told her I was glad. I told her Helen would have been glad. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, in a silence that for the first time in years did not feel like absence. Tonight, Liam had left before noon for the tugboat job 30 miles offshore. He had radioed Claire at 6 to say the marine frequency was unreliable. She had told him she loved him and would see him tomorrow. She turned her phone off after parking in my driveway. She did not want Liam to hear her voice before she had spoken with me, before she had figured out what came next. She looked at her hands resting on the table, the swollen finger catching the light differently from the others. Then she looked at me, and she said his name. I heard it. I know I heard it correctly, but I sat in my chair without moving, and the clock above the refrigerator counted out 3 full strokes before I let out the breath I had been holding. I wanted to have heard wrong. I needed for just a moment to believe I had misunderstood her. Claire did not look away. She held my eyes across the table and said the name again. Slower this time. Clearer. The way you repeat something to a person when you understand they need to hear it twice before it becomes real. Brendan. And the name sat between us on that kitchen table like an anchor dropped through the floor. Tell me everything, I said. From the beginning. And she did. In the particular way a person tells you something when their body has not yet finished deciding whether it survived. Words that had to travel a longer distance than usual before they reached her mouth, as if the events themselves were still arranging their weight inside her. I did not move. I did not reach for my coffee. I sat across from her in Helen's kitchen with my hands flat on the table, and I listened the way I had learned to listen in the boatyard when something was wrong, completely, without filling the silence with anything of my own. She had opened the door because Brendan came with what looked like a white flag, a bottle of single malt scotch. Good label. The kind you bring when you want someone to believe the gesture is genuine. He was smiling when she answered the knock. Not the tight, performative expression she had seen at family gatherings for 4 years. Something that looked, she said, like effort. Like a man trying. He told her he wanted to start over. That he had not been fair to her. That Liam deserved better from his older brother, and so did she. Claire, because she is at her core, a person who believes the harbor always has room for one more boat, stepped aside and let him in. I heard that, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not surprise. Something closer to recognition, because I knew, sitting at that table, that I had spent 4 years making the same calculation she had made at that door. Giving Brendan the benefit of what I had told myself was patience. I thought about the first dinner, the evening Liam brought Claire home maybe 3 weeks after they had started seeing each other. Brendan had been polite in the way that costs nothing and gives nothing. Handshake. 2 sentences. Eyes that moved past her to the rest of the room. I had told myself he was reserved, that he needed time. I thought about the engagement party. Brendan arrived 40 minutes late and left before the cake was cut. Said he had an early call with an underwriter. I did not push it. I thought about the wedding. He gave a toast that lasted 90 seconds. The quartet started playing before the silence after it had fully settled, which I understood now was a kindness on the musician's part. I told Liam afterward that Brendan was not a man who expressed himself easily. That was the word I used. Easily. And then the smaller things, the kind that standing alone could each be dismissed. The remark at Thanksgiving about the way Claire had arranged the table settings. The comment at Easter about which college she had attended. The way he would redirect conversations about Liam's work to Liam himself even when Claire was mid-sentence, as if her words had a volume only he could not quite hear. Each one by itself looked like nothing. Looked like personality. Looked like a man who was difficult in the ordinary way. Some people are difficult. Sitting at my kitchen table at midnight, I understood what I had been looking at for 4 years. Not individual moments. Architecture. Not a man who needed time. A man who had already decided and who had spent 4 years being consistent about it in ways small enough to escape consequence. Claire continued. They sat in the living room. Brendan poured 2 glasses and pushed one across the coffee table toward her. She declined. Told him simply that she was not drinking tonight. He looked at her. Not a long look. Look in her you, my Murray. This 80, Ada, and F. Look in her. Just a beat, a fraction of a second where his attention sharpened and then smoothed itself back out. He said that is fine and stood to get more ice from the kitchen. She did not think anything of it at the time. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, she said, running through whether she believed any of what he had told her at the door. What she did not know, and only understood later, was that when Brendan walked through the living room, he passed the coffee table where her copy of What to Expect When You're Expecting lay open and face down beside the lamp. She had been reading it that afternoon on the couch and had not thought to put it away. She had not been expecting anyone. 2 things. He had 2 things. A woman who declined a drink without explanation and a pregnancy book open on the coffee table. For a man like Brendan, precise and observant, the kind of person who processes information the way an underwriter processes risk, 2 data points were enough. He came back from the kitchen and sat down. And he began to speak in a voice that was, Claire said, calmer than any raised voice she had ever heard. Calmer. And because of that, worse. He told her that Liam had married her out of obligation. That was the word he used. Obligation. He said it without heat. The way you state a fact you have held for a long time and no longer feel the need to soften. He said there were things about her. And the not specifying was its own kind of precision that Liam would eventually come to understand. He said she had never truly belonged on this coast. I listened, and I thought about every moment I had filed under personality. Every timber I had watched Brendan place, without understanding he was building something. 4 years of small deliberate acts laid end to end, and I had called each one nothing, because calling it nothing was easier than calling it what it was. Claire said she stood up. She told him to leave. Brendan did not leave. He stood up too, and he moved toward her in the way she described as deliberate. Not rushed, not out of control, but with the particular steadiness of a man who had decided what he was going to do before he ever knocked on the door. The way a hull moves through water when the engine has already been set to full ahead, steady, with no intention of changing course. There are moments in a shipwright's life when you hear a sound that tells you everything has changed. Not a crash. Not the dramatic splintering you might imagine. Something smaller and more precise. The particular note a joint makes when it has been forced past the limit of what it was built to hold. A sound that lives in the material itself, in the wood or the bone, and that you recognize instantly even if you have never heard that exact version of it before. Claire told me what happened next in the voice of a woman whose body had not entirely finished processing what it had been through. Each sentence arrived with a weight behind it, like cargo being unloaded from a hold one piece at a time. She had backed into the hallway. Brendan followed. She reached the front door and put her hand on the knob, and that was when he closed the distance between them. His hand found her wrist. Not a grab born of impulse, she was clear about that. His fingers wrapped around her forearm with the deliberate grip of a man who had already calculated how much force he intended to use before his hand ever moved. She pushed back against his chest with her free hand and told him to get out. He pulled. One motion. Not wild, not frantic. A single controlled pull that broke her grip from the door handle and sent her weight shifting backward toward the open doorway behind her. The front porch of the house on Harbor Street sits 4 granite steps above the walkway. That is how they build them in Gull Harbor. Coastal houses sit high to keep the storm surge out of the ground floor. And the steps are granite, because granite is what this part of Maine has more of than anything else. Each step is roughly 8 inches tall with a square edge that has not been softened by weather or wear, because granite does not soften. It endures. That is the whole point of it. Claire went through the doorway backward. Her shoulder hit the first step. Her hip caught the second. Her body folded over the edge of the third, in a way that sent a sound through her ribcage she described as something tearing loose inside a wall. Her left hand grabbed for the wooden railing as she fell, and her index finger caught between 2 balusters at an angle the finger was not designed to hold. She heard it before she felt it. A small, dense sound. The kind that lives in the bone. She came to rest at the bottom of the steps on the flagstone walkway. She did not scream. She told me this without apology, as though she understood I might wonder. She said her entire body went to one place, not to the pain in her ribs, which was already climbing towards something enormous, not to the finger, which had begun to swell before she could even look at it. Her whole self went to her abdomen, to the question that was the only question that mattered in that moment. She pressed her hand flat against herself, and she waited. Listened inward the way a person does when they are trying to hear something they are terrified they might not hear. The way you press your ear against the hull of a boat in dry dock and listen for the creak that tells you whether the frame is still sound. Brendan stood at the top of the steps. He did not come down. He did not ask if she was hurt. He did not reach for his phone. He stood on that porch in the salt fog, with the light behind him, and he looked down at her the way a man looks at something he has assessed and found to be less than he expected, less than he required. And he said, in a voice that was low and unhurried and clear on every syllable, no Callahan worth the name would let that woman carry his line. Claire had not confirmed the pregnancy to anyone outside of my kitchen 3 weeks ago. Not to Brendan. Not to the extended family. Not to anyone. He did not know. He suspected. 2 data points assembled by a precise and calculating mind, but he did not know with certainty. I thought about that when she told me. I have thought about it many times since. A man who knows something for certain and acts on it is one kind of dangerous. A man who only suspects and is willing to say what Brendan said anyway, willing to aim that sentence at a woman lying at the bottom of his stairs on granite, is something else. Something that does not have a clean name, but that I recognize sitting at my kitchen table at midnight as the thing I should have been paying closer attention to for years. Brendan came down the steps. He did not look at her again. He stepped past her the way you step past something on a dock that is not your concern. And he walked to his car. And he pulled the door shut with the quiet care of a man leaving a house where nothing has happened. The engine started. The headlights swept across the fog. And then there was nothing. Just the sound of the ocean below the bluff and the salt air settling on everything the way it always does in Gull Harbor, slowly and without preference, covering what is broken and what is whole, with exactly the same weight. Claire lay on the flagstone at the bottom of the steps. The fog came in around her, and the porch light above cast a pale circle that ended just past where she was lying, as if the light itself could only reach so far and no further. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, and she held still. And she listened. She did not know yet whether the child inside her was still alive. She did not know how long she lay there, because time does not move normally when your body is deciding what it can and cannot do. The pain in her ribs arrived fully in waves, each one clarifying what the previous one had only suggested. Breathing became a negotiation. Every inhale cost something. She lay on the cold stone with the fog pressing down, and she listened for the only answer that mattered. And she waited. She told me about the crossing from Harbor Street to my house, the way a sailor tells you about a passage that nearly killed them. Not with drama, not with the embellishment that comes when a person has had time to shape the story into something more bearable, with the particular calm of someone who has already survived it, and is now simply reporting the coordinates, so that someone else can understand the distance. Her car keys were on the kitchen counter. Her phone was beside them. She had set both down when she came home from the library that afternoon, the way she always did. She did not need to go upstairs to reach them. She needed to get from the flagstone walkway through the front door and across the hallway floor into the kitchen. That was the distance. In a healthy body, it would have taken 15 seconds. In the body she was working with that night, it became its own kind of voyage. She pulled herself up the granite steps one at a time, using the railing with her right hand because the left was already swelling past the point of use. Each step required a full stop at the top to let the pain in her ribs settle from a roar to something she could think over. She described the feeling as a tide inside her chest, rising with every movement, receding just enough between efforts to let her gather what she needed for the next one. She made it through the front door. She crossed the hallway on her hands and knees because standing sent a current through her rib cage that made her vision go white at the edges. The kitchen counter was 6 feet from the hallway threshold. She reached it and pulled herself upright, using the drawer handles, and stood there for a long time with both hands flat on the countertop, breathing in the shallow, deliberate way that had become the only kind of breathing available to her. She picked up her keys. She picked up her phone. She walked to the car in the driveway and sat behind the wheel and turned the phone off. She told me this plainly. She did not want Liam to call and hear her voice before she had spoken with me. She would not explain what had happened to her husband over a crackling marine radio from 30 miles offshore in rough seas in the middle of the night. Not like this. Not before she had figured out what came next. That decision, made in a driveway with cracked ribs and fog rolling across the windshield, told me more about who Claire was than anything I had learned about her in 4 years. She was not running. She was navigating. Harbor Road runs along the coast from the village center out to the bluffs on the north side of town. During the day, it is a pleasant drive. The kind tourists photograph from their car windows. At night, in heavy fog, it becomes something else entirely. The road has no center line for the last 3 miles. The shoulder drops off into rock and salt grass, and then the sea. On a clear night, you can see the water. On a night like that one, you can only hear it. Close and constant, moving alongside you in the dark like something patient. Claire drove slowly. She told me she kept the window cracked because the sound of the waves gave her a reference point when the fog swallowed the road ahead. Twice she pulled into the gravel lot at Parsons Cove, the small fishing wharf where the lobster boats tie up overnight, and sat with the engine running until the pain dropped from unbearable to merely severe. She did not turn the headlights off either time because she was afraid that if she sat in complete darkness, she would not make herself start driving again. 25 minutes. That was the crossing. Harbor Street to Whalers Bluff. 25 minutes through salt fog on a road with no center line, with 2 cracked ribs and a finger that had already turned the color of a plum and a question inside her that she could not answer until someone with a Doppler and steady hands told her what she needed to hear. She ended up on my porch. On her knees. In the fog. With the porch light, Helen's porch light, falling across her face. I had heard all of it now. Every room she had walked me through, every door she had opened, and made herself stand in long enough to describe what was on the other side. She had given me the whole passage from start to finish, and she had not once lost her heading. I put my hand over hers on the table. Both of mine over both of hers. The way my father used to do when something had moved past the reach of words, and you needed to say that without speaking. His hands had been larger than mine and rougher from decades of dock work and rigging, but the gesture was the same. You place your hands over theirs and you hold still, and you let the weight of your presence say what your voice cannot. Claire looked up at me, and for the first time since she had started talking, since she had walked through every room of that evening and made herself stand in each one long enough to describe it completely, her eyes filled. Not from pain, something past pain. The particular release that comes when a person has been carrying something alone through fog and dark water and has finally, after a long time, found the harbor. I stood up and picked up my phone from the counter. This time she did not reach for my wrist. I called 911 first because the body comes before the case. I gave the address. I said there was a woman with injuries who needed an ambulance. I gave them enough and not more, because some of what had happened in that house tonight was not for a dispatcher to hear before a doctor had examined Claire and before I had made one more call. The call I was already composing in my mind while the ambulance was still on its way. The ambulance arrived in 13 minutes. I know because I counted. There are things you do when you are trying not to think ahead of yourself. Counting is one of them. I learned it from Helen, who used to count the ceiling tiles in waiting rooms when she was working to hold herself together. 14 years as a nurse's aide at this same hospital had taught her how to be still in medical spaces. I never learned that from her. I learned the counting and nothing else. I rode with Claire. The paramedics did not argue about it. I sat on the narrow bench along the side wall and held her right hand because her left was splinted and wrapped and no longer available. She looked at the ceiling of the ambulance the entire ride. Her lips moved once, very slightly, forming words I could not hear over the engine. I did not ask what she said. I knew what I would have been saying in her position, and it was not meant for anyone in that vehicle. Gull Harbor General is a small hospital in a small harbor town. 2 floors, a parking lot that empties after 9, corridors that smell of antiseptic, and the particular kind of coffee that has been sitting on a burner longer than coffee should. The emergency entrance is on the east side facing the water, though you cannot see the water from the door. The automatic doors slid open, and the paramedics wheeled Claire through, and a nurse met them at the threshold with the efficiency of someone who has done this thousands of times before. A woman in scrubs touched my arm and told me I could wait to the left. 4 plastic chairs against a white wall under fluorescent lights that had no interest in being kind to anyone sitting beneath them. I sat down. The clock on the wall read 1:18 in the morning. I looked at it once and then deliberately looked away. Helen came to mind the way she always does, on her own schedule, without asking permission. She had moved through these corridors for 14 years, with a comfort I never managed. Whenever something required a waiting room, Helen was the one who sat without fidgeting, who spoke to the doctors in their own language, who made the whole experience feel like something a person could get through. I had always called that a skill. Sitting alone in this hallway, I understood it was something larger. It was the ability to be fully present in a hard moment without looking for the exit. I thought about Helen and Brendan. She had understood him in ways I had not allowed myself to. She told me once, after a dinner where Brendan had spent the evening looking past everyone at nothing in particular, that he needed to feel like he mattered. Not loved, she said. Mattered. There was a difference in her mind, and she was precise about it. When he felt that, she said, he could be warm in his quiet way. When he did not, he became something colder than ordinary mood could explain. He just needs time, I had told her. She looked at me over her coffee cup with the expression she kept for when she thought I was wrong, but had decided not to press the point. I had read that look as disagreement about Brendan. Tonight, sitting in a plastic chair at 1:30 in the morning, I understood she had been looking at me. The doctor came through the door at 3:14, a compact woman with gray at her temples, and the unhurried manner of someone who delivers difficult news often enough to have learned how to hold it steady in her hands before setting it down in front of you. She sat in the chair beside mine and spoke quietly. 2 cracked ribs on the left side. The index finger had been dislocated at the proximal joint, reduced and splinted. Bruising across the left side of the face consistent with blunt impact, no fractures to the orbital or jaw, no internal bleeding. She paused. In that pause, I stopped breathing entirely. The baby was fine. Heartbeat strong and regular, confirmed on Doppler. 10 weeks along. No signs of distress. I closed my eyes. I held that information inside me for a long moment before I let myself do anything else with it. Whatever Brendan had aimed at Claire on those granite steps, whatever he had been willing to risk with one sentence spoken into the salt fog, it had not landed. Not tonight. When I opened my eyes, I took my phone from my pocket. Not Liam. Not yet. Claire had asked, and I was honoring that until morning. Not Brendan. Say 4. That conversation, if it ever happened, would not be tonight and would not come from me alone. I scrolled to one name. Phil. My older brother. 74 years old. 30 years on the Federal Maritime Bench before he retired. A man who had spent his entire career on a single conviction: that the truth, given the right hull and enough patience, always finds its way to shore. I pressed call. The line rang once, then a second time. Phil picked up on the second ring. Not the third, not the fourth, the second. That was Phil. That had always been Phil. 74 years old. 4 years into retirement. And he still answered the phone like a man who had been expecting your call all along. Art. Not a question. Just my name, said the way he has said it for 70 years, with the particular weight of someone who already understands that if I am calling at this hour, the reason is real. I need to tell you something, I said. Then tell me. I stood at the window at the end of the hallway, the one that looks out over the dark parking lot toward the harbor. I told Phil everything. Not the way I wanted to tell it, which was with all the anger and confusion still tangled together, but the way he had taught me, the way our father had taught him. Facts first, art, feelings after. He had said that to me the first time when I was 11 and had come home from a fight on the docks so shaken I could barely form a sentence. Tell me what happened before you tell me how you feel about it. I gave him the timeline, every point, every detail. When I finished, there was a silence on his end, brief and organized. The silence of a man who is not searching for words but arranging the ones he already has. Do not call Brendan, he said. Do not let him know. Text Liam at 6. I need to make some calls. I asked him what he was going to do. There was a pause. Not hesitation. Rhythm. What Papa taught us, he said. I knew exactly what that meant. Our father was not a loud man. He was not quiet in the way people sometimes mean when they say quiet, which is passive, which is absent. He was quiet the way the ocean floor is quiet, present beneath everything, bearing the weight of what moved above it, and entirely unmoved by the noise at the surface. Captain Seamus Callahan spent 30 years on the water and another 12 working the harbor office at Gull Harbor Port Authority. He understood currents, the visible kind and the kind that run beneath the surface where you cannot see them until something gets pulled off course. He applied that understanding to everything, to boats, to weather, to people, and most of all to the difference between what a man says and what a man does when he believes no one is keeping a record. When I was in my late 20s, a storm came through the Gulf of Maine that the fishing families still call the October blow. 1987. 3 boats sank. 2 more were damaged beyond repair. 21 families filed insurance claims with the regional marine carrier that had covered the Gull Harbor fleet for over a decade. Every single claim was denied. The company cited policy language that had been revised 18 months before the storm. Language that narrowed the definition of covered peril in ways that were technically legal and practically devastating. 21 families who had paid their premiums on time for years were told that the storm that had destroyed their livelihoods fell outside the boundaries of what the policy was designed to protect. The fishermen complained. They wrote letters. A few hired an attorney from Portland who looked at the revised language and told them honestly that the company had built its wall carefully and that breaking through it would be expensive and uncertain. Most of the families could not afford expensive and uncertain. The complaints went quiet the way complaints do when the people making them run out of money and energy at the same time. Papa did not complain. He went to work. He had access to the harbor office filing system, 30 years of docking records, cargo manifests, insurance certificates, and correspondence between the carriers and the Port Authority. He began cross-referencing the denied claims against the policy revision timeline, against the premium payment records, against the original policy language that had been in effect when the families first signed on. He worked at his desk during lunch. He worked in the evening at the kitchen table. He recorded every discrepancy he found in the journal. The same journal. The one I had been holding in my kitchen 3 hours ago looking at Helen's handwriting. The first third of that journal is not recipes. It is Art Callahan's handwriting, small and precise, documenting 8 years of a single insurance company's systematic failure to honor the contracts it had written with the families of Gull Harbor. 8 years. He did not file a complaint during that time. He did not go to the press. He did not stand up at a town meeting and make a speech. He built his case the way he built everything. From the waterline up, one plank at a time, making certain that every joint was true before moving to the next. When he was finished, he walked into the regional office of that insurance carrier on a Tuesday afternoon with the journal under his arm. He sat down across from the claims director, and he opened it to the first page and he began to explain, quietly and without raising his voice, what was in it. The settlement was $210,000, distributed among 21 families. He did not ask for recognition. He did not hold a press conference. He came home that evening and put the journal back in the drawer beside the stove, and he made himself a cup of coffee, and he sat in the kitchen the way I sit in it now. I was 29 years old. I remember standing in the doorway watching him, and understanding for the first time that the most powerful thing in any room is not the loudest voice. It is the most complete record. Phil had learned that lesson better than I ever did. I had always been the brother who wanted to act, to move, to confront. Phil had learned to be patient in the way Papa was patient, to build before he moved, to document before he spoke. I had spent 70 years admiring that quality in both of them and struggling to replicate it in myself. Tonight, for the first time I could remember, I did not want to act. I wanted to wait. The anger was there, real and low in my chest, but underneath it, something cooler and more deliberate had settled into place. And I recognized it as the first thing Phil had ever taught me that I had fully absorbed. Not the patience itself, the trust that patience, when it is built on a complete record, is not passivity. It is precision. I sat in the hallway of the hospital, and I thought about what I had allowed myself not to see for 4 years. Helen had seen it. She had told me in her way, not directly, because that was not how she worked, but in the careful observations she offered, like weather reports, calmly, without alarm, trusting that I would read them correctly. I had not read them correctly. I had watched Brendan look past Claire at dinners and called it reserved. I had watched him leave early from celebrations and called it busy. I had watched him deliver a 90-second toast at his brother's wedding and called it a man who does not express himself easily. Sitting in that corridor at 3:30 in the morning, I finally named what I had been looking at. It was not indifference. It was envy. Not of Claire, but of Liam. Of what Liam had found and held on to while Brendan had hollowed himself out to the point where that kind of connection was no longer something he could reach, honestly. He could not build it. So he had spent 4 years doing the next available thing, eroding it. One small deliberate act at a time, like water working at the base of a cliff. I had known something was wrong. Not this. Not tonight. But I had felt the unease for years and chosen not to examine it. Because examining it would have meant doing something about it. I saw the cracks in the hull and I told myself they were just the grain of the wood. Helen would have done something. That is the truth I sat with alone in that corridor, and it was simpler and harder than any excuse I had built around it. Before Phil hung up, he had said one more thing. His voice did not change, but something in its weight shifted. The way the sea shifts register before a weather system arrives. There is one more thing, he said. But I want to wait until I have confirmed it fully. Give me until tomorrow morning. What I will tell you is this. What happened to Claire on Wednesday night did not happen in a vacuum. Brendan was not careful about everything. The line went quiet before I could ask what that meant. I stood at the window with the phone in my hand and turned those last words over the way I used to turn a piece of timber in the shop, feeling for the place where the surface told you something the eye alone could not see. Not careful about everything. I did not know yet what shape that sentence would take. I only knew that Phil had been building something since 3:30 in the morning, and that whatever he had found in the dark was larger than Wednesday night. I recognized Liam's walk before I saw his face. Always slightly faster than necessary. Always like a man heading toward a boat that needs him. That is how he has moved through the world since he was old enough to run down to the harbor on his own, with the urgency of someone who believes that if he gets there quickly enough he can fix whatever has gone wrong. Even now. Even at 7:30 in the morning after driving 2 hours on no sleep from a disabled tugboat 30 miles offshore. He came down the hospital corridor with dust from the engine room still along his jaw and his shirt wrinkled in the way of a man who had grabbed it from wherever he left it and not thought twice. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying, not yet, but from the road, and from whatever those 2 hours had done to him after he finally got a signal strong enough to receive my text at 6. I had kept the message short the way Phil instructed. Come to Gull Harbor General. Claire is here. She is safe. Come now. Liam walked straight past me into Claire's room without a word. I did not stop him. He needed to see her first. Needed to see with his own eyes that she was breathing and present before any conversation with me could mean anything. Some things between a husband and a wife must happen before the father gets his turn. I sat with my cold coffee from the vending machine and waited. 20 minutes later, he came back out. He sat down in the chair beside mine and put his face in both hands, and his shoulders moved. In the way shoulders move when a person is holding something too large for the space available. I put my hand on his back. Flat. Between the shoulder blades. The same way I had put it there when he was 9 years old and had fallen off the dock at Parsons Cove and could not decide whether he was more hurt or more embarrassed. That was the summer Helen taught him to swim in the harbor, holding him up in the cold water with both arms until his body understood that it could float on its own. When he lifted his head, his eyes were dry. Liam has always been that way. The grief goes inward before it ever comes out. It sinks to the bottom and sits there, settling into the hull where you cannot see it but where it changes how the whole vessel moves through the water. Tell me everything, he said. So I told him. All of it. In the same order I had told Phil. Facts first, the way our father taught. Liam listened without interrupting. He was still in the way he is still when something requires his full attention. The stillness of a man who has trained himself to process before he reacts, the way you train yourself in an engine room, where reacting before you understand the problem can cost you a hand. When I reached the part about the granite steps, his jaw tightened. Not a flinch. Something more structural. Something that locked into place. When I reached the sentence Brendan had spoken before walking to his car, Liam stood up. I need to go to Brendan's house. His voice was even. That was what told me how serious he meant it. Not the words. The evenness. The way a sea that has gone completely flat is not calm. It is gathering. No, I said. You are going to stay here with your wife and your child. Phil is handling this. Trust me. The look on his face was not simple. What I saw was not only anger, though the anger was there, banked low like a fire in a wood stove, told to wait. Underneath it was something that hurt worse, something without a clean name. Liam had grown up watching Brendan the way younger brothers sometimes watch older ones, with a quality of attention that does not ask to be returned. Brendan was 12 when Liam was born. Already capable and certain, already moving through the world with the confidence that a 4-year-old and then an 8-year-old and then a teenager files away as a standard to measure himself against. Helen had said it once on a Sunday evening after Brendan had come for dinner and left early. She said Liam loves Brendan the way only a younger brother can. Completely. And without conditions. That is why if Brendan ever truly lets him down, it will not just hurt him. It will break something that cannot be put back the same way. I had remembered that sentence many times over the years. I had never understood it as completely as I did now. Watching my son sit back down in the plastic chair and press his hands flat on his thighs and look at the floor. The expression of a man who has just discovered that the keel he built his whole understanding on was never as true as he believed. He was not deciding whether to trust me. He was deciding how to carry the weight of what it meant that his older brother, the man whose confidence he had spent 37 years measuring himself against, had stood at the top of 4 granite steps and looked down at Liam's pregnant wife and done nothing. Finally, he nodded. Not with relief, with the particular resignation of a person who has concluded that the people he trusts have not yet led him wrong, and he is going to hold to that even when every instinct tells him to move. Phil knows what he is doing, he asked. Phil has never sailed without charts. Liam stood up and went back into Claire's room. The door closed behind him with the soft click of someone who has decided to put his energy somewhere it can actually help. I sat back in the chair. I did not know what Phil had found. I knew only what I had always known about my brother, that when he said he needed to make some calls, he was describing the beginning of something built the way our father built things. From the waterline up, with nothing left to chance. What I did not know yet was how far back what Phil was building actually went. Sitting in that hallway, I was not ready to learn that the thing he had uncovered in the dark had nothing to do with Wednesday night, that it had been there for years, patient and quiet and waiting, like the seafloor. Invisible until the tide pulls back far enough to show you what has been lying underneath all along. Phil called at 6:45 the next morning. He sounded like a man who had just returned from a long, productive voyage, rested and organized, regardless of whether he had slept. That was something Phil had learned in 30 years on the federal bench. How to sound like a man who has had a full night's rest, no matter what the night required. I have never been able to replicate it. I was standing at the window at the end of the hospital corridor when the phone rang. The parking lot outside was turning from gray to pale gold as the sun came over the harbor. I answered before the second ring. "Tell me," I said. "Good morning to you too," Phil said. Then, "Here is what I have." He spoke the way he always does when delivering something he has built carefully. Not rushing, not editorializing. Moving through each point the way a surveyor moves through a chart. With the methodical patience of a man who understands that clarity is more valuable than speed. Thursday night after our call, he had contacted 3 people. The first was a retired maritime investigator he had worked alongside for 2 decades. The second was a family law attorney whose judgment he trusted completely. The third was a former colleague now practicing civil litigation who understood both the criminal and financial dimensions of what Phil was beginning to see take shape. He had asked each of them the same question. If a person gained access to someone's home under false pretenses, physically assaulted them causing documented injuries, and made a verbal threat directed at an unborn child, what were the legal options and what evidence would matter most? All three had given him what he needed. He spent the rest of Thursday night building a framework from their answers. Then he had called Gil. Gil Ferreira drove the FedEx route that covered the north end of Gull Harbor. Phil knew him from First Harbor Baptist Church, where they had served on the same outreach committee for 4 years. He called Gil at 7 Thursday morning, explained briefly what had happened to Claire, and asked whether Gil had been making deliveries on Harbor Street Wednesday evening. There was a pause on Gil's end. Not the pause of a man searching his memory. The pause of someone deciding something. I had a late stop on that street, Gil said. Package for the Hendersons, across from your nephew's place. I was parked there, around 8:30, maybe 8:45. Phil asked if his dashcam had been running. It is always running, Gil said. Come by the depot this morning. I will pull the footage. The dashcam was mounted on the windshield of Gil's delivery truck, angled wide enough to cover the full width of the street. The footage Phil reviewed showed Brendan's car leaving the driveway at 8:45 Wednesday evening. It showed the same car returning at 10:20. The timestamps lined up precisely with what Claire had described. But there was something else on the footage. After pulling into the driveway at 10:20, Brendan did not go inside. He sat in the car for 18 minutes. The interior light was off, but the phone screen illuminated his face twice during that period. Once when he appeared to receive a call. Once when he initiated one. Phil explained what that meant in practical terms. Phone records, call logs, duration, the numbers dialed. All of it could be subpoenaed in a civil proceeding. A judge issues the order to the carrier. The carrier produces the records. The process takes time. But the process was already in motion. A man who acts in a moment of rage goes inside and pours himself a drink, Phil said. A man who sits in his car for 18 minutes, making phone calls, is a man who is already thinking about consequences. That distinction matters enormously, Art. It goes to intent. It goes to premeditation. It changes the legal character of what happened on those steps. I asked who Brendan had called. Phil said the subpoena process had been initiated through the civil attorney. Based on what his investigator contact had determined through other channels, the most likely recipient of at least one of those calls was Brendan's personal attorney, a man retained for business matters. A man calling his lawyer 18 minutes after assaulting a pregnant woman. Phil was right. The distinction mattered. Phil had also spoken with Liam early Friday morning before Liam went back to sit with Claire. He had asked Liam a series of specific questions, dates, incidents, things Liam had witnessed or been told over 4 years. Liam had been reluctant at first. Reluctant in the way a person is when answering honestly means dismantling something they have been working hard to keep intact. But Phil asked with dates. Specific ones. And when Liam answered with those dates in front of him, a pattern emerged that was harder to dismiss than any individual incident on its own. The engagement party Brendan arrived 40 minutes late to and left before cake. The toast at the wedding. The Thanksgiving remark. The Easter comment. The way conversations were redirected past Claire, as though she were weather rather than a person in the room. Brendan had not been reacting to Claire over 4 years, Phil said. He had been consistent, methodical. The difference mattered because consistency is a choice. It demonstrates intent. When someone hurts a member of your family, Phil said. And his voice did not change in pitch, but something in its weight shifted. You can respond with anger, or you can respond with strategy. Anger feels better in the moment. Strategy is what holds. I thought about our father and the journal and the 8 years of patience and the afternoon he sat down in that office and let the record speak. There is one more thing, Phil said. But I want to wait until I have confirmed it fully before I tell you. Give me until tomorrow morning. I asked what that meant. It means, he said, That Wednesday night may not be the only thing we are dealing with here. But I need one more day. He ended the call. I stood at the window with the phone in my hand and looked at the harbor filling with morning light. What I did not know was how deep the water actually ran beneath the surface Brendan had been showing us for years. Phil arrived at the house on Saturday morning carrying a brown accordion folder that I had not seen since the year he retired from the bench. He set it on the kitchen table next to Helen's recipe book and looked at me the way he used to look at defendants who had not yet understood the weight of their own signatures. "Sit down, Art," he said. "This is going to take a while." I poured 2 cups of coffee. The fog had lifted overnight, and pale light came through the east window, laying a thin gold stripe across the table. It was the first morning since Wednesday that the kitchen did not feel like a room holding its breath. Phil opened the folder and spread 6 pages across the table in 2 neat rows. Each page was a photocopy of a federal tax filing, Form 990, submitted annually by the Coastal Preservation Fund to the Internal Revenue Service. The fund had been established 11 years earlier to maintain public shoreline access, restore the old breakwater, and sponsor summer maritime education camps for children in the harbor towns. Brendan had served as board director for the last 5 years. His name appeared on every filing in the row marked principal officer. "I pulled these from the public database Thursday night," Phil said. "Anyone can access them. They are not sealed, not privileged, not protected. They are as public as a lighthouse beam." He placed his index finger on the first page, the filing from 3 years ago. The fund had reported total revenue of $187,000 that year, mostly from municipal grants and 2 private donors whose families had fished the harbor for generations. Reported expenses included $41,000 for breakwater materials, $28,000 for camp operations, and $22,000 for administrative costs. The numbers looked ordinary. They were designed to look ordinary. "Now watch," Phil said. He turned the page and pointed to a line item labeled Consulting Services Coastal Engineering. The amount was $38,500. Phil slid a second document beside it, a vendor registry he had obtained from the county clerk's office. There was no coastal engineering firm registered under the name listed on the filing. The address matched a post office box in Rockport, 14 miles north, leased to a single-member LLC, whose registered agent was a paralegal in Brendan's own office. I felt the coffee turn cold in my hand, although I had not set the cup down. Phil moved to the second year. The same line item appeared again, this time for $42,000, routed to the same post office box, but under a slightly different company name. The third year showed $51,500 paid to a third variation of the same shell entity. In addition, $48,000 across the 3 years had been categorized as event coordination for fundraising galas that, according to the harbor's community calendar archive Phil had printed, either never occurred or were hosted at no cost by the First Harbor Baptist Church Fellowship Hall. "Total," Phil said, and he wrote the number on a yellow legal pad in block letters so I could read it from across the table. "Yuan. The figure sat on the pad like a scar. I stared at it and thought about Captain Seamus and the journal and the 8 years he spent documenting an insurance company's refusal to honor 21 fishing families. The settlement Seamus won was $210,000, the same number. My son had taken from the community the exact amount my father had spent a decade fighting to return to it. Phil let the silence hold. He understood that some facts need room the way a hull needs water beneath it before it can move. He created 3 shell companies, Phil continued. Each one lasted roughly 12 months, billed the fund for services that were never performed, and dissolved before the next fiscal year began. The pattern is clean, deliberate, and traceable. A first-year auditor could follow it. Brendan was not hiding. He was counting on no one looking. I asked Phil how he had known to look. He leaned back and folded his hands the way he used to do on the bench before delivering a ruling that would change someone's life. "Wednesday night, when you called me at 3 in the morning, you described a man who struck a pregnant woman and then spoke a sentence that sounded rehearsed. That is not rage, Art. That is authority. And authority of that kind does not grow in one evening. It grows in a man who has been operating without accountability for a long time. So I asked myself where else Brendan holds power. The fund was the obvious answer. He gathered the pages back into the accordion folder and placed his palm flat on top of it. I have already spoken with Margaret Solis at the State Attorney General's office. She is aware. I have also filed a referral with the IRS Exempt Organizations Division. Both investigations will proceed independently of the criminal matter. Claire's case is assault. This is fraud. Two rivers running from the same source. I looked at the journal sitting beside Helen's recipe book. 3 layers of handwriting, 3 generations. Seamus had written about hulls and tides and the patience required to find a crack that everyone else had overlooked. Helen had written about clam chowder, and the way love sometimes looks like a warm bowl, placed quietly on a table without a word. The blank pages waited. Phil stood and carried his cup to the sink. He rinsed it, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf exactly where Helen always kept it. He had been in this kitchen 1,000 times. He knew where everything belonged. There is one more thing, he said, turning from the sink. The paralegal who registered those companies left Brendan's office 7 months ago. She has not signed a non-eye disclosure agreement. Margaret already has her name. He picked up the folder. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. Papa used to say that the sea does not punish. It simply reveals what was built poorly. You did not build Brendan poorly, Art. But you and I are going to make sure the tide finishes what it started. The door closed behind him. I sat at the table with the journal open to a blank page. The gold stripe from the east window had moved an inch across the wood. For the first time in 3 days, I picked up a pen, and I began to write. I did not sleep Saturday night. I sat in the chair beside the east window with the journal open on my lap and the pen still in my hand. But no new words came after the first paragraph I had written that afternoon. The gold stripe had long since left the table. The kitchen was dark, except for the small light above the stove that Helen had insisted we install the year Brendan turned 12 because he used to come downstairs for milk and bump into the counter. I was thinking about that boy. The one who bumped into the counter. The one who used to stand at the end of the dock with a fishing rod he could barely hold and refused to come inside until he caught something, even if it was only a piece of kelp. I was thinking about the man that boy became and trying to find the exact place where the timber split, the precise joint where the grain changed direction, and I failed to notice. Phil had told me not to call Brendan. Margaret Solis had told Phil the same. The legal process had its own current, and it did not wait for a father's need to understand. But the legal process was not going to ask Brendan the question that had kept me awake since Wednesday night. The question that no Form 990 or dashcam recording could answer. Why? Sunday morning I made coffee and sat on the porch. The fog was thin, almost transparent, and I could see the breakwater for the first time in 4 days. The tide was halfway out. Gulls circled above the exposed rocks, the way they always did when the ocean pulled back and revealed what it had been holding. I thought about Seamus and his patience. I thought about Helen and her quiet way of placing a bowl of chowder in front of someone without asking whether they were hungry. And I thought about the fact that patience, in this moment, felt less like wisdom and more like a door I was afraid to open. At 9:15, I picked up the phone and called my son. He answered on the 4th ring. His voice was flat, the voice of a man who had been expecting a call, but not this one. I heard the sound of a television in the background, low, and the clink of a glass being set on a hard surface. "Dad," he said. I had rehearsed nothing. I had no legal pad, no accordion folder, no numbered list of questions. I had only the sound of his breathing on the other end of the line and 33 years of memories that refused to arrange themselves into anything that made sense. "I need you to tell me why," I said. There was silence. Not the kind of silence that means a person is thinking. The kind that means a person is deciding how much of the truth they can afford. "She called you," he said. It was not a question. She drove 25 minutes through fog with 2 broken ribs and a dislocated finger. She knelt on my porch and said your name. So yes. She called me. Another silence. I heard him exhale slowly. The sound of a man arranging his face, even though no one could see it. You do not have the full picture, Dad. Then give it to me. It is more complicated than she made it sound. I closed my eyes. I had built boats for 41 years. I knew what it sounded like when someone described a crack in the hull as a cosmetic issue. I knew the difference between a man who was explaining and a man who was managing. Brendan, I said. And I used his full name the way Helen used to when she needed him to understand that the conversation had moved past the point where charm would work. I have seen the medical report. I have seen the photographs. I have spoken with your brother. I am not calling to hear your version of events. I am calling because I am your father. And I need to know why you put your hands on a pregnant woman and told her that her child does not belong in this family. The television sound disappeared. He had either muted it or walked into another room. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, tighter. Stripped of the professional smoothness I had heard him use at town council meetings and fundraising dinners. That baby is going to change everything, he said. Liam does not see it. He has never seen the way this family actually works. He fixes boats. He does not understand what it takes to maintain what I have built. What you have built, I repeated. The fund, the board seats. The relationships with the selectmen, the donors, the coastal commission. 10 years of work, Dad, and now Liam is going to have a child. And suddenly everyone will look at him as the one carrying the family forward, and none of what I have done will matter. I held the phone away from my ear for a moment and looked at the breakwater. The tide had pulled back another foot. More rocks were visible now, dark and slick, covered with barnacles that had been growing unseen for years. You struck her because you were afraid of being forgotten, I said. He did not answer. You struck a woman who weighs 120 pounds and is carrying a 10-week-old child because you were afraid that a baby would make your brother more important than you. That is not what I said. That is exactly what you said. You just used different words. I heard him breathe. 1 breath. 2. 3. I am not going to ask you to apologize to me, I said. That is not mine to receive. But I am going to tell you something that your mother told me once, and I did not understand it until this week. She said that you need to feel like you matter. She was right. But Brendan, the way you have chosen to matter has broken something that I am not sure I can repair. He said nothing. Phil has the records, I said. All of them. The line was quiet for a long time. Then I heard a sound I had not heard from my eldest son since he was 9 years old, and fell off the dock and thought he was drowning. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man realizing that the water he had been standing in was no longer shallow enough to walk out of. I hung up the phone. I set it on the porch railing and watched the tide continue its slow, irreversible retreat. Monday came the way most consequential days come in a harbor town. Quietly. The fog had pulled back to a thin white line along the horizon, and the water in the cove was still enough to hold the reflection of the breakwater like a photograph laid flat on glass. I stood at the kitchen window with coffee and watched a lobster boat motor out past the channel markers, its wake spreading in 2 clean lines behind it. Helen used to say that Mondays were the ocean's way of asking whether you had learned anything over the weekend. I had learned more than I wanted. Phil called at 7:30. His voice carried the particular steadiness that I recognized from his years on the bench, the tone he used when he had already made every decision that mattered and was simply informing the parties involved. Margaret Solis moved faster than I expected, he said. The Attorney General's office has formally opened an inquiry into the Coastal Preservation Fund. They will issue a preservation order on all financial records by end of business today. The IRS referral is in process. And Art, the paralegal, her name is Dana Hewitt. She agreed to a voluntary interview yesterday afternoon. I set the coffee down. What did she say? Enough. She said Brendan asked her to register the first LLC 3 years ago. He told her it was a standard consulting arrangement. By the second year, she knew it was not. She prepared the invoices herself. She left the firm 7 months ago because she could not sleep. She has not signed any confidentiality agreement, and she is willing to provide a sworn statement. I thought about Dana Hewitt, a woman I had never met, lying awake in some apartment with the weight of someone else's dishonesty, pressing against her ribs the way 2 cracked bones pressed against Claire's lungs every time she took a breath. Different injuries. Same architect. There is more, Phil said. The retired detective I consulted, Frank McGuire, ran a background check through public records. Brendan's firm holds 3 active contracts with the town of Gull Harbor: road access easements, pier maintenance, drainage studies, all awarded during his tenure on the Coastal Commission. None went through competitive bidding. The lobster boat had disappeared around the point. Its wake had flattened back into still water as though it had never passed. How much are the contracts worth? I asked. Combined, roughly $340,000 over 4 years. Whether that constitutes a conflict of interest or something more will depend on the audit. But the pattern is consistent with what we already know. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. $210,000 from the fund. $340,000 in town contracts. My son had built a small empire out of paper and silence, and the trust of people who believed that a Callahan's handshake still meant what it had meant when Seamus was alive. Phil continued. I spoke with the family law attorney, Ruth Kavanaugh. She recommends that Claire file a formal protective order today. It strengthens the criminal case and establishes a legal boundary while the district attorney reviews charges. I have already discussed this with Claire and Liam. Claire agreed. And the criminal case? The district attorney's office received the police report, the medical records, and the dashcam footage this morning. Ruth expects they will offer Brendan a diversion agreement rather than take it to trial. 18 months of supervised probation, a violence intervention program, a no e-contact order with Claire, and a prohibition from holding any fiduciary or board position during the probation period. That is not prison, I said. No, Phil said. It is not. But it is a leash. And if he violates any term, the original charges are reinstated in full. Ruth believes this is the most effective path. A trial would take 14 months, cost Claire her privacy, and risk a jury in a small town where Brendan still has friends on the select board. I opened my eyes and looked at the journal on the table. Seamus had spent 8 years building a case against an insurance company. He had not rushed. He had not aimed for the most dramatic outcome. He had aimed for the one that held. Tell Ruth to proceed, I said. Phil paused. There is one more thing. The civil attorney, James Okenga, is filing a separate action against Brendan on behalf of the fund's board to recover the $210,000. The court will order an independent audit. If the audit confirms the shell company payments, the fund can seek full restitution plus damages. James believes the case is strong, and Brendan's board seat? Suspended as of this morning. The board voted unanimously last night after Margaret's office contacted the chair. He is removed from all decision-making authority. Effective immediately. I carried my coffee to the porch. The cove was turning from silver to blue as the sun climbed. Somewhere out on the water, Liam was probably standing on the deck of a repaired tug, looking toward shore and thinking about Claire in the hospital bed, and the child growing inside her, and the life they had planned together in a small house 3 streets from the harbor. He had called me the previous evening and said only 5 words. We are naming her Helen. I had not been able to respond. I held the phone against my ear and let the silence carry what language could not. Now, on the porch, I thought about names and what they carry. Helen. The woman who placed chowder on a table without announcement. The woman who told me Brendan needed to feel that he mattered. The woman who wrote recipes in a journal beside her father-in-law's notes about hull cracks and tidal patterns because she understood that a family's history is not a single story, but a braid of stories wound together so tightly that you cannot pull one strand without feeling the others. Move. But a name is not only a memorial, It is a promise. To name a child Helen is to say that gentleness is worth continuing, that quiet strength is not weakness, that the act of placing something warm in front of someone who is suffering is as important as any verdict delivered from a bench or any settlement won in a courtroom. I set the coffee on the railing and opened the journal to the page I had begun writing the day before. Below my first paragraph, I added a second. It was short, only 3 lines, and I will not share them here because some words belong only to the page they are written on and the hand that wrote them. But I will say this. For the first time in 8 years, the blank section of the journal did not feel empty. It felt like a room that had been waiting for someone to walk in and sit down. The tide was coming back. I could see it in the way the water crept over the dark rocks near the breakwater, covering the barnacles inch by inch, restoring the smooth surface that made the harbor look whole again. It would go out again. It always does. But for now it was returning. And that was enough. The hearing took place on a Thursday, 19 days after the night Claire knelt on my porch. I know the exact count because I marked each day in the journal the way Seamus used to mark days at sea, a short horizontal line, no commentary, just proof that time had passed and the vessel was still afloat. Phil drove me to the county courthouse in his dark blue sedan. Neither of us spoke for most of the ride. The road followed the coast, and the ocean was gray and flat, the kind of surface that gives nothing back when you look at it. Phil parked in the rear lot behind the building. He turned off the engine and sat with both hands on the wheel for a moment. "You do not have to go inside," he said. "Yes, I do. He will not look at you." "I know." The courthouse was a brick building on Prospect Street. 2 stories. Built in 1931. With a brass plaque beside the front door, honoring veterans of 3 wars. I had passed it 1,000 times in my life, and never once imagined that I would walk through those doors because of my own son. Phil held the door open for me, and we entered together. Ruth Kavanaugh was waiting in the corridor outside courtroom B. She was a small woman, early 50s, with short gray hair and a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived more than a few difficult mornings. She shook my hand and told me the proceeding would be brief. The district attorney had finalized the diversion agreement. Brendan's attorney had reviewed and accepted the terms. All that remained was the judge's approval and Brendan's formal acknowledgement on the record. He will stand. He will confirm his name. He will confirm that he understands each condition. The judge will ask if he accepts voluntarily. He will say yes. And then it will be entered, Ruth said. How long will it take? 15 minutes. Perhaps 20. Claire was not present. Ruth had advised her to stay home, and Liam had agreed. There was no legal requirement for the victim to attend a diversion hearing, and Ruth believed that Claire's presence would serve no purpose other than to reopen a wound that was still stitching itself closed. I understood. Some rooms are not meant for healing. They are meant for records. We entered courtroom B at 9:45. It was a small room, wood-paneled, with 6 rows of benches and a judge's bench elevated by 2 steps. An American flag stood in the corner beside a state flag. The overhead lights hummed at a frequency I could feel in my teeth. There were 4 other people in the room. The district attorney, a young woman with a legal pad, a court reporter, the judge, a man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and Brendan. He was standing at the defense table beside his attorney, a man named Garrett Hollins, whom I recognized from town. Brendan wore a dark suit I had not seen before. His hair was combed. His shoes were polished. He looked like a man arriving at a board meeting, not a man answering for what his hands had done on a set of granite steps 19 days earlier. He did not look at me. Phil and I sat in the second row. Phil placed the accordion folder on the bench beside him, not because he needed it, but because it was part of him now, the way the journal was part of me. We sat and waited. The judge called the case. The district attorney read the terms of the agreement into the record. I listened to each one, the way you listen to a hull inspection report when the boat is yours and the water is deep. 18 months of supervised probation. Mandatory enrollment in a certified violence intervention program. Sessions to begin within 30 days. A no-contact order with Art Callahan. Effective immediately. And lasting the full probation term. Prohibition from holding any fiduciary position, board seat, or financial authority role in any nonprofit or public entity for the duration of probation. Requirement to surrender his position as director of the Coastal Preservation Fund, which had already been executed. Acknowledgement that any violation of these terms would result in the immediate reinstatement of the original criminal charges, including felony assault. The judge looked at Brendan. Mr. Callahan, do you understand these terms as read? Yes, Your Honor. Do you accept them voluntarily and without coercion? Yes, Your Honor. His voice was even, controlled. The same voice I had heard on the phone Sunday morning, but polished now, reassembled into the shape of a man who knew how to stand in a room and say the right words. I looked at his hands, resting flat on the table. Those hands had learned to hold a fishing rod on my dock. They had learned to grip a sanding block in my workshop. They had learned to shake the hands of selectmen and donors and community leaders. And on a Wednesday night in October, they had gripped the wrist of a woman carrying his brother's child and pulled her backward down 4 granite steps. The judge signed the order. The court reporter's fingers stopped. Garrett Hollins gathered his papers. Brendan buttoned his jacket. And then, for the first time since we entered the room, he turned his head and looked at me. It lasted less than 3 seconds. His eyes moved from my face to Phil's, and then to the accordion folder on the bench. He held there for a moment, on the folder, and I saw something pass across his expression that I could not name precisely, but that reminded me of the look. A man gives a closed door when he realizes he left something essential on the other side, and the lock has already turned. He walked out through the side door without speaking. Phil and I sat in the second row for another minute after the room emptied. The overhead lights continued to hum. The flags hung motionless. Phil placed his hand on my shoulder. The same gesture I had placed on Liam's back in the hospital corridor. The same gesture Seamus had placed on my hands the morning he told me that patience was not the absence of action, but the presence of attention. "It is done," Phil said. "No," I said. "It is entered. Done is something else." We walked out through the front door, past the brass plaque, into a morning that smelled of salt and October leaves. The ocean was still gray. The breakwater held its line, and somewhere on the other side of town, my firstborn son was driving away from the courthouse in a dark suit, with 18 months of supervised silence ahead of him, and a family that would never again look at his name the same way. November arrived, the way it always does on the coast of Maine. The wind changed direction. It came from the northeast now, carrying the smell of deep water and the promise of early frost, and the harbor emptied of pleasure boats until only the working vessels remained. Lobster boats, a few trawlers, the Coast Guard cutter that sat at the municipal pier like a patient dog. The leaves on the 3 maple trees beside the library had turned a color that Helen used to call heartbreak red. She said it every autumn. And every autumn I told her that was not a real color. And every autumn she pointed at the trees and said, "Then what would you call it? Art Callahan?" I never had a better answer. 5 weeks had passed since the hearing. Claire had been discharged from the hospital the day after the ambulance brought her in, but she returned twice for follow-up examinations. The ribs were healing. The finger had been reset and splinted, and she wore a small brace that she removed each evening to do the stretching exercises the physical therapist had prescribed. She was 14 weeks pregnant now. The nausea had eased. She told me this on a Sunday afternoon while sitting in the kitchen with a cup of ginger tea, and when she said it, she placed her hand on her stomach the way she had on the porch that first night, except this time she was not holding something together. She was greeting someone. Liam had taken a leave from the shipyard. He spent his days repairing their house, the 4 granite steps where Claire had fallen, the wooden railing where her finger had caught and twisted. He replaced every board on those steps, He did not repair them. He removed them entirely and built new ones from pressure-treated oak, wider, with a railing that a person could grip with one hand and not let go. I offered to help. He said no. I understood. Some things a man has to build with his own hands in order to believe they will hold. The audit began in the second week of November. James Okenga had secured a court order appointing an independent forensic accountant named Patricia Yuen to examine the Coastal Preservation Fund's finances for the 5 years of Brendan's directorship. Patricia worked out of Portland. She was 58 years old, had audited 11 nonprofits for the Attorney General's office over the past decade, and according to James, she had a reputation for finding money the way a harbor seal finds fish quietly, thoroughly, and without surfacing until the job was done. Phil relayed the updates to me each week over coffee at the kitchen table. He had positioned himself as the family's liaison with the legal team, a role that suited him the way the bench had suited him, and I was grateful because the language of forensic accounting was not a language I had ever learned to speak. I understood wood. I understood water. I understood the difference between a joint that would hold for 50 years and one that would fail in 5. But shell companies and vendor registries and IRS, Form 990 line items, were Phil's ocean, not mine. In the third week, Patricia Yuen delivered her preliminary findings to James Okenga, who shared them with Phil, who sat at my table on a Tuesday evening and laid it out. The 3 shell companies Phil had identified were confirmed. All 3 had been registered by Dana Hewitt at Brendan's direction, operated through the Rockport post office box, and dissolved within 12 to 14 months of creation. Total payments from the fund to these entities over 3 years: $132,000, categorized as consulting fees for coastal engineering services that were never performed. The $48,000 in Eventu coordination fees that Phil had flagged was also confirmed. Patricia had cross-referenced the fund's claimed fundraising galas with venue records, catering invoices, and the harbor community calendar. 2 of the 4 events had never taken place. The other 2 had been hosted at no cost by First Harbor Baptist Church, with food donated by the Women's Auxiliary. The $48,000 had been paid to a 4th entity. This one registered not in Rockport, but in Camden, 26 miles up the coast, under the name of a college roommate of Brendan's, who told investigators he had no knowledge of the company or the payments. That brought the confirmed total to $180,000. Patricia was not finished. She had identified an additional $30,000 in expense reimbursements submitted by Brendan personally over 4 years for travel, lodging, and meal costs associated with conferences that either did not exist or that Brendan had not attended. Hotel records and airline manifests did not match the claim dates. Some receipts had been altered. Others had been fabricated entirely. RC1 Mayuan. The number landed on the kitchen table the same way it had landed on Phil's yellow legal pad 5 weeks earlier. It sat there between our coffee cups like a stone pulled from the ocean floor, heavy and dark and older than it appeared. "It matches," I said. Phil nodded. "It matches." Neither of us said what we were both thinking, because some parallels are too heavy for language. My father had spent 8 years documenting an insurance company's refusal to honor the claims of 2001 fishing families. The settlement he won, the amount that restored those families' ability to repair their boats and feed their children and stay in the harbor, was $210,000. And now, a generation later, my son had stolen the identical sum from a fund created to serve the same community. Seamus would not have called it irony. He would have called it a hull that was never properly inspected. James Okenga filed the audit results with the court the following Monday. The civil case would proceed to a recovery phase. The fund's reconstituted board, now chaired by a retired schoolteacher named Edith Carmichael, would seek full restitution of the $210,000 plus legal costs and potential damages. The state attorney general's investigation remained active and could result in additional charges independent of the civil action. The IRS review of the fund's tax-exempt status was ongoing. Phil told me all of this in the same steady voice he had used since the night I called him at 3 in the morning. He had not raised his voice once in 5 weeks. He had not speculated. He had not moralized. He had gathered facts and placed them in order the way Seamus had placed entries in the journal, one line at a time, one day at a time, until the weight of evidence was sufficient to move something that had seemed immovable. I closed the journal that evening and set it on the shelf beside Helen's recipe book. The blank pages were less blank now. Not full, not finished, but no longer waiting in the way they had waited for 8 years. Something was being written, not a story of triumph or revenge, but a record, the kind Seamus would have recognized, careful, patient, true. Outside, the northeast wind pressed against the house. The harbor was dark, except for the navigation lights on the breakwater and the distant glow of the Coast Guard cutter. Somewhere in that darkness, the tide was doing what it always does, pulling back, revealing, returning. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The first snow came on the last day of November. Not a storm, just a thin dusting that settled on the porch railing and the breakwater rocks and the roof of the workshop I had not opened since September. I stood at the kitchen window and watched it fall the way I had watched it fall every year for 33 years in this house, and for a moment the world looked the way it looks in the space between an exhale and an inhale, suspended, weightless, waiting for whatever comes next. Claire was 20 weeks pregnant. Halfway. She had begun to show in a way that made strangers at the grocery store smile and ask when she was due. She answered with the same calm she brought to everything mid-April, she would say. And then she would place her hand on her stomach, and the conversation would become about the future instead of the past. I admired that, the ability to stand in a grocery aisle with 2 healed ribs and a finger that still ached on cold mornings and direct a stranger's attention toward a life that had not yet arrived. She came to the house every Sunday. Liam drove her, and they sat in the kitchen the way Helen and I used to sit, one of them at the table, the other leaning against the counter, talking about small things that were not small at all. Groceries, doctor's appointments. The color they had chosen for the nursery, a pale green that Claire said reminded her of sea glass. Liam installed a new shelf in their bedroom for the baby books Claire had been collecting from the library's discard pile. He described the shelf to me in detail: white pine, 42 inches, French cleats, and I recognized in his voice the same satisfaction I used to feel when a joint came together cleanly and I knew it would hold. On the first Sunday of December, Claire arrived carrying a paper bag from the harbor fish market. She set it on the counter and looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. Something between determination and tenderness. The face of a woman who had made a decision and was about to share it. "I want to make Helen's chowder," she said. I did not move for a moment. The recipe book was on the shelf beside the journal, where it had sat since the night Helen died. I had not opened it. I had not moved it. I had not let anyone else touch it. Not because I was protecting it, but because opening it meant hearing Helen's voice in my head reading the ingredients aloud the way she always did. Even when she knew them by heart, even when she had made the same recipe 100 times, because she believed that saying the words out loud was a way of honoring the hands that had written them down. Claire waited. She did not push. She stood at the counter with the paper bag between her hands and let me arrive at the answer in my own time. I reached up and took the recipe book from the shelf. It was a hardcover composition book, black and white, the kind you could buy at any stationery store for $2. Helen had covered it with clear contact paper to protect it from kitchen spills. Her name was written on the inside cover in blue ink, Helen Marie Callahan, and beneath it, in smaller letters, the date she had started it, the 14th of June, 1980, 3 weeks after our wedding. I opened it to the chowder recipe. Page 7. Helen's handwriting was small and precise, the letters leaning slightly to the right, the way she leaned. When she listened to someone carefully, the recipe called for little neck clams, salt pork, Yukon gold potatoes, heavy cream, thyme, and a single bay leaf. At the bottom of the page she had written a note in pencil. Art likes it thick. Add 1 extra potato and let it sit 10 minutes before serving. He will not ask for this, but he will notice. I read that line 3 times. Then I handed the book to Claire. She held it the way you hold something that belongs to someone else's history, but has just been offered to you as part of your own. She read the recipe silently, her lips moving over the ingredients the way Helen's had. Then she looked up at me. She wrote notes on all of them, Claire said. Every one. Claire turned the pages slowly. Beef stew with a note about Liam preferring carrots cut thick. Blueberry pie with a reminder to use less sugar because Phil was watching his intake. Cornbread with a line that said, "Brendan will eat 4 pieces. Let him." She stopped on that page. I saw her eyes hold on Brendan's name, and I saw the small movement in her jaw, the tightening that was not anger, but something quieter and more complicated. The recognition that a woman who had loved her son enough to count his pieces of cornbread had raised a man capable of doing what he had done on those granite steps. Claire closed the book gently and set it on the counter beside the paper bag. "Can I keep this?" she said. "Not forever. Just until I learn them." "You can keep it," I said. "Helen would have wanted that." "How do you know?" I looked at the book on the counter, at Helen's name on the inside cover, at the clear contact paper she had pressed over the cardboard to keep it safe from water and time and the ordinary accidents of a kitchen where a family was fed. "Because she wrote it for whoever came next," I said. She just did not know who that would be. Claire picked up the book and held it against her chest with both hands, the way she had held her stomach on the porch that first night. Liam stood in the doorway watching. He did not say anything. He did not need to. We made the chowder together that afternoon. Claire read the instructions aloud, every line, including the notes. I peeled the potatoes 4, not 3, the way Helen had written. Liam diced the salt pork. The kitchen filled with the smell of cream and thyme and something I had not felt in that room for 8 years. The presence of a meal being made not out of hunger but out of continuation. We ate at the table. 3 bowls. 1 empty chair. And inside Claire, a 4th person waiting to arrive. A girl, who would be named Helen, who would grow up in a harbor town where the tide goes out and comes back, and the fog lifts and returns, and the people who stay learn that the things worth keeping are rarely the things that shine the brightest. They are the things written in pencil at the bottom of a recipe page, in handwriting that leans slightly to the right, by someone who loved you enough to notice what you would never think to ask for. Winter settled over Gull Harbor the way it settles over every coastal town in Maine, not suddenly, but with a kind of patient insistence, the way a tide rises 1 inch at a time until you look up and realize the rocks you were standing on are no longer visible. By mid-January, the harbor was rimmed with a thin crust of ice that cracked and reformed each morning with the current. The lobster boats went out less frequently. The breakwater wore a white collar of frozen spray, and the lighthouse on Kettle Point, decommissioned for 19 years, stood against the gray sky like a finger raised in permanent warning. I had not spoken to Brendan since the phone call in October. 3 months. I knew through Phil that he had enrolled in the Violence Intervention Program, as required by the diversion agreement. Sessions took place in Portland, 90 minutes each way, every Tuesday. His probation officer filed reports that Phil did not share with me, and I did not ask to see. I knew that Brendan had closed his office on Harbor Street and moved his practice to a smaller space inland, in a town called Bridgeton, 40 miles from the coast. I knew that his name had been removed from the brass donor plaque in the lobby of the community center, and from the letterhead of the Coastal Preservation Fund. I knew these things the way you know the tide schedule, not because you go down to the water every day, but because the information arrives whether you seek it or not. What I did not know was whether my son understood what he had broken. Not the ribs, not the finger, not the trust of a community that had given him awards and board seats and the benefit of every doubt. What I did not know was whether he understood that the thing he broke was the distance between who he was and who he believed himself to be. And that distance, once visible, cannot be hidden again. Phil came for coffee on a Saturday in late January. He moved more slowly now. The winter had settled into his left knee the way it had settled into the harbor, quietly and without apology. He sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the mug and told me that the civil case was proceeding well. James Okenga had filed a motion for summary judgment based on Patricia Yuen's audit. The reconstituted board under Edith Carmichael's leadership had submitted a claim for full restitution of the $210,000 plus $47,000 in legal fees and forensic accounting costs. Brendan's attorney had not contested the audit findings. A settlement conference was scheduled for February. He will pay, Phil said. The question is whether the payment will come voluntarily or by order. Garrett Hollins is advising him to settle. If he does, the fund recovers its money faster, and Brendan avoids a public judgment that would follow him into every future business transaction. And if he does not settle, then the court orders it. Either way, the money returns. The difference is time and dignity, and Brendan has spent most of both. I looked at the window. Snow was falling again, heavier than the first dusting in November, the kind of snow that erases footprints and property lines and the boundary between the yard and the road, the kind that makes everything look like it belongs to the same landscape. There is something else, Phil said. He set the mug down and folded his hands in the way I had come to recognize as the prelude to a sentence he had been carrying for a while. Edith Carmichael called me yesterday. The board has voted to rename the summer maritime camp. What was it called? The Callahan Coastal Youth Program. I felt the name land in my chest the way a hammer strikes a chisel. Precise, concentrated, irreversible. Brendan had established the camp 6 years ago, using fund money, and had named it after our family. It was the program that appeared in the newspaper photographs. The one that earned him the Community Leadership Award. The one that parents mentioned when they shook his hand at the 4th of July parade. And now the board was removing our name because our name had become a liability. What will they call it? The Gull Harbor Maritime Youth Program. Simple. Accurate. No family attached. I nodded. It was the right decision. I knew that. But knowing a thing is right and feeling it land in the same place are two different experiences, and they do not always arrive at the same time. Phil watched me for a moment. Then he said something that I have carried with me every day since. Art. A name is not a house. You cannot lose it to a storm. It does not collapse because one beam fails. A name is more like a harbor. It holds what sails into it. Seamus brought honor into the Callahan Harbor. Helen brought warmth. You brought steadiness. Brendan brought damage. But the harbor is still there. The water is still deep. And in April, a new vessel is going to sail in carrying the name Helen Callahan, and she will not know any of this history for years. And by the time she does, the harbor will have held enough good to make the damage small. I did not respond immediately. I sat with his words the way I sit with the sound of the tide when it is close enough to hear from the porch, but not close enough to see. Present. Patient. Arriving. Claire called that evening. She was 30 weeks pregnant now. The baby was the size of a cabbage, she said. And I could hear the smile in her voice, even through the phone. She told me that the nursery was finished. Pale green walls. The white pine shelf Liam had built. A rocking chair that she had found at an estate sale in Bath. She had placed Helen's recipe book on the shelf beside the baby books. I read one recipe every night before bed, she said. Last night was the cornbread. She paused. I waited. I am not angry anymore, Papa Art. I do not know what I am. But it is not anger. What does it feel like? She was quiet for a moment. And I heard her shift in the rocking chair. The creak of old wood finding its balance. It feels like the harbor in winter, she said. Still. Cold. But deep enough to hold whatever comes. I closed my eyes and listened to the creak of the chair through the phone and the wind outside my window and the distant sound of the breakwater doing what it has always done, standing between the open ocean and the quiet water, absorbing the force of things that would otherwise destroy what is sheltered behind it. She arrived on the 12th of April, at 6:23 in the morning, in the same hospital where her mother had been carried on a stretcher 5.5 months earlier with 2 cracked ribs and a swollen eye. Gull Harbor General. East Side entrance. 2nd floor. Room 2. 14. The same hallway, the same overhead lights, but a different season and a different kind of waiting. Liam called me at 5:41. His voice was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something enormous and trying to describe it in ordinary language. "It is time, Dad. We are at the hospital. Claire says to come." I drove Harbor Road in the dark. The fog was gone. The sky was clear, and the stars were still out, fading at the eastern edge, where the first pale line of dawn was beginning to press upward. I passed Parsons Cove, where Claire had stopped twice on that October night, with the engine running and her hand on her stomach. The wharf was empty. The water was calm. I kept driving. Phil was already in the waiting room when I arrived. He sat in a plastic chair, with his hands folded in his lap, and the accordion folder nowhere in sight. He wore a flannel shirt I recognized as one that had belonged to our father. I had not seen it in years. "Seamus's shirt," I said. It seemed appropriate. We sat together in the waiting room the way we had sat together in courtroom B, except this time the overhead lights did not hum, and the flags on the wall were not flags but posters about handy washing and visitor policies. Phil did not speak. I did not speak. We listened to the sounds of the hospital the way you listen to the harbor at dawn: footsteps, distant voices, the occasional beep of a monitor, the soft mechanical rhythm of a building that exists to hold people at the most fragile edges of their lives. At 6:23, a nurse came through the double doors and said the words that I have heard fathers and grandfathers describe for 70 years, but that no description had ever made real until I heard them spoken to me in a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and new morning. "Mr. Callahan, you have a granddaughter." Phil put his hand on my arm. I put my hand on his. 2 brothers, 70 and 74, sitting in plastic chairs in a hospital waiting room, holding on to each other the way their father had once held on to a journal, and their mother had once held on to a recipe, and their whole family had always held on to the quiet things, because the quiet things were the ones that lasted. They let us in at 7:15. Claire was sitting up in bed with the baby against her chest. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was tired and open and luminous, in a way that I can only describe as the way the harbor looks, when the fog lifts completely and the sun hits the water, and for a few minutes everything is so clear that you can see all the way to Bruised, the bottom. Liam stood beside the bed with one hand on Claire's shoulder and the other resting on the edge of the blanket near the baby's feet. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet, and he did not wipe them, and he did not look away. "Dad," he said, "this is Helen Seamus Callahan, Helen." For the woman who wrote recipes in pencil, and counted pieces of cornbread, and placed bowls of chowder on a table without asking whether anyone was hungry. Seamus. For the man who spent 8 years filling a journal with the truth because he believed that patience was not the absence of action, but the presence of attention. I stepped forward, and Claire tilted the baby toward me. She was small, 6 pounds and 11 ounces, with a face that had not yet decided who it would resemble, and hands so new that they had never touched anything except the inside of the person who had carried her through October and November and December and January and February and March and the first 12 days of April, through cracked ribs and a dislocated finger and a courtroom she never entered, and an audit she would not understand for decades, and a winter harbor that was still and cold and deep enough to hold whatever came. I held her. She weighed almost nothing. She weighed everything. Phil leaned over my shoulder and looked at her face. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice so low that only I could hear it, "The harbor just got deeper." I carried Helen to the window. The sun had fully risen. Gull Harbor spread below us, the breakwater solid against the incoming tide. The fishing boats heading out through the channel markers, the 3 maple trees beside the library beginning to show the pale green of early spring. Somewhere in that town, the Coastal Preservation Fund was being rebuilt under new leadership. Somewhere, a settlement check was being drafted to return $210,000 to the community that had earned it. Somewhere, my eldest son was sitting in a room in Bridgeton with 18 months of supervised quiet ahead of him and a family that had chosen truth over silence and a niece he was not permitted to meet. And here, in room 214, a girl named Helen Callahan was breathing against my chest. And the journal at home had blank pages waiting. And the recipe book sat on a nursery shelf beside baby books, and the breakwater held its line. And the tide came in. I looked down at my granddaughter. Her eyes were closed. Her hand curled around my index finger with a grip that was impossibly small and impossibly certain, the grip of someone who had just arrived and already knew how to hold on. "Welcome to the harbor," I whispered. The morning light moved across her face. She did not open her eyes. She did not need to. She was already home.